The first thing my daughter-in-law said loud enough for the whole room to hear was this: "Your Honor, my father-in-law is just a broken-down old firefighter who never amounted to anything. He's been living off charity for years." You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. The ceiling fans hummed. Somebody shifted in their seat near the back. My son Kevin sat 2 rows behind me, and I heard him exhale sharply through his nose, the way he's done since he was 12 years old when something made him angry. I didn't look at Renata right away. I gave myself a long second. 28 years of watching her at Christmas dinners, at Kevin's hockey tournaments in Barrie, at our granddaughter's baptism in the little stone church outside Sudbury. She was wearing a dark gray blazer I'd never seen before, her hair pulled back the way she always wore it when she meant business. Then I looked at the judge. He'd been writing something when she said it. His pen stopped moving. He lifted his head slowly and looked across the courtroom, and when his eyes found my face, something happened in his expression that I can only describe as a man suddenly recognizing something he thought he'd buried a long time ago. I said his name quietly. "Lawrence." His chair pushed back from the bench. He stood up. "My God," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Henry Croft?" The courtroom had been a medium-sized, ordinary legal room in a building that smelled like floor wax and old radiator heat. Suddenly, it felt like the walls had moved outward 6 feet in every direction. Renata's lawyer, a compact man named Steele with a very confident tie, looked from the judge to me with the careful expression of a man who has just realized he may have misread something important. He'd spent the better part of 40 minutes telling the court I was a financial burden, an absentee grandfather, and a man whose only contribution to the family estate had been to accept their generosity. He'd been enjoying himself right up until that moment. Now he was not enjoying himself. Judge Lawrence Beaumont sat back down slowly. He did it the way older men do, measuring the distance to the chair. But his eyes never left me. "We'll take a recess," he said. 20 minutes. Renata looked at Kevin. Kevin looked at me. I folded my hands on the table in front of me and sat quietly, feeling every year of 67 settle into my lower back the way it always does when I've been sitting on wooden chairs too long. That was the moment my daughter-in-law understood. She didn't know who she was dealing with. But to explain how any of us got into that room, I have to go back a ways. I grew up in Chapleau, a small town in northern Ontario that most people south of the French River have never heard of. My father worked the railway. His father had worked the railway before him. There was a time when Chapleau smelled like diesel and wood smoke, and the particular cold that comes off the Canadian Shield in October, the kind that gets inside your clothes and reminds you it owns the place. I joined the fire service at 22, not because it was heroic, because Lenny Bergstrom's father was the fire chief, and Lenny said they were hiring, and I needed work that meant something. I ended up staying 31 years, most of it in Sudbury, eventually as a senior captain with Station 4. I'm not going to tell you it was glamorous. It was shift work and paperwork, and a lot of waiting around punctuated by moments that changed you permanently whether you wanted them to or not. I met my wife Helen in 1983 at a fall fair outside Espanola. She was running a booth selling preserves for her mother's church group, and I told her the peach jam was the best I'd ever tasted. She told me I probably hadn't tasted much peach jam in my life, if that was my benchmark. I married her 8 months later. We had Kevin in 1986, moved to Sudbury for the posting, bought a semi-detached on Lorne Street with a backyard just big enough for a vegetable garden, and a second-hand hockey net. Helen used to say the house was smaller than her parents' garage. I told her that was what made it ours. Those years were good years, the real kind. Skates to sharpen in November, Easter dinners that took 3 days to cook, staying up until 2 in the morning with a sick kid even when you had a 6 a.m. shift. Nothing you'd put in a movie, everything you'd want back. Helen passed away in 2019. Pancreatic cancer. It moved fast, which the doctors told us was in some ways a mercy, and I suppose they were right, but it didn't feel like a mercy at the time. It didn't feel like a mercy for quite a while after, either. After she died, things got harder in ways I didn't have language for. The house in Sudbury became very quiet very fast. I'd spent 31 years running into burning buildings, but I didn't know what to do with four walls and no sound. Kevin and Renata had been living in Oakville by then. Kevin had done well for himself, project management for a construction firm. Good salary, nice house in a neighborhood with mature trees and a homeowners association that cared very much about the height of your hedges. Renata had her own real estate business. They had two girls, Lily, who was 8, and Sophie, who was 5. Good kids, both of them. When Helen died, Kevin asked me to move closer. I sold the Sudbury house and bought a small bungalow 20 minutes from them in Burlington. The idea was that I'd be nearby, help with the girls, be part of things. And for a while, that's how it was. Then gradually it wasn't. I noticed it in small ways first. Dinners where Renata answered questions I hadn't asked. Conversations where Kevin seemed to be translating between two languages. Comments about the bungalow. It was dated, it was too far from good schools. For when the girls got older, it was the kind of neighborhood that was going to depreciate. Little observations that accumulated the way ice does on a window ledge. So quietly, you almost don't notice until the whole thing is bowing inward. After Helen died, I'll tell you honestly, I wasn't easy to be around. I know that. I got quieter than I'd ever been. There were mornings I'd sit at the kitchen table with my coffee for an hour and a half without moving, because I simply didn't know what I was supposed to be organizing myself toward. There were grocery stores I stopped going into because the cereal aisle, of all things, still had the brand Helen used to buy, and I couldn't stand there looking at it. I never told Kevin any of that. Men from my generation don't broadcast those things. You carry them the same way you carry a heavy pack. You adjust your posture, and you keep walking, and you hope people don't notice the way your shoulders are sitting. Renata noticed, but she interpreted what she saw differently than what it was. She thought I'd become passive, difficult, a project. Kevin tried. I'll give him that. But he was caught between two people he loved, and that is a position that grinds a man down whether he's 35 or 60. He started agreeing with things just to stop the friction. That's how marriages survive sometimes, and how other relationships don't. The property was the thing that finally broke the surface. My parents had a piece of land outside Chapleau. 60 acres on a lake, nothing fancy. An old cabin that needed work every spring, a dock my father had built in 1968 that had been repaired so many times it was basically a philosophical exercise at this point. But it had been in the family for 50 years, and when my mother passed it came to me, and when Helen and I were alive we used to spend 2 weeks there every August without exception. Renata wanted to sell it. The market was good. She had a buyer. She'd already had a conversation with a developer in Timmins. She presented it to Kevin one evening as a practical decision, and Kevin, exhausted and outnumbered, brought it to me as something we should seriously consider. I said no. That was the beginning of the end of things. 6 months later, Renata's lawyer sent a letter suggesting that given my diminished capacity to independently manage significant assets and my pattern of financially dependent behavior, I'd borrowed $4,000 from Kevin during a rough patch 2 years earlier and paid back every cent, which the letter somehow neglected to mention. A formal arrangement might be in order. The letter was careful and polite, and it made me feel approximately the same way a building feels just before the roof comes off. That was how we ended up in a courtroom in Hamilton on a Tuesday in March. I'd spoken to a lawyer, a woman named Adaisy, who had an office near the waterfront, and who listened to my whole story without writing anything down, and then asked me 3 questions, the last of which was, are there any documents that prove the land was never joint property? There were. Several. I'd brought them myself. But it was what happened when I said Lawrence Beaumont's name that changed everything else. The recess lasted not 20 but 35 minutes. Lawrence had called for it the moment he recognized me. When he came back into the courtroom, he walked more carefully than he used to. A slight favoring of his left side I'd noticed from across the room. He was 64 now, by my estimate. Silver-haired, reading glasses on a lanyard, the gravity that comes to men who've spent decades making serious decisions in serious rooms. But he looked at me the same way he had 30 years ago, when he was young and cold and terrified, and I was pulling him out of a situation he wasn't sure he was going to survive. A bailiff appeared at my elbow. The judge wanted a brief word in chambers. Renata's lawyer shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I must register my—" "Registered," Lawrence said calmly and stood up. I followed the bailiff down a corridor that smelled like government buildings always smell. Old carpet and too warm air and decades of fluorescent lighting. Lawrence's chambers were exactly what you'd expect. Bookshelves. A desk buried in files, a framed photo of Lake Superior on the wall. A ceramic moose someone had given him that sat on the windowsill, looking like it wasn't sure how it had ended up there either. The moment the door closed, Lawrence just looked at me. Then he shook his head and laughed quietly to himself. Not a happy laugh. The kind older men make when they're confronting something they can't quite believe is real. "You got old, Henry." "I had help," I said. He came around the desk and he did something I wasn't expecting. He shook my hand with both of his and held on a moment longer than a handshake requires. "The way you hold on to something you thought you'd lost for good." "I looked for you," he said. "For years. You'd transferred by the time I started asking. That surprised me more than I showed. I didn't think you'd remember much. You were in pretty rough shape." "I remember everything." He said it without any drama. "Just a fact." He moved back behind his desk and sat down. I sat across from him, the same chair presumably used by many people who needed things from Lawrence Beaumont and who had gotten to him through more conventional channels. "Tell me what happened," he said. "All of it." So I did. Helen dying, the quiet, selling the Sudbury house, moving to Burlington with the hope of being useful to my son's family, the small erosions, the property dispute, Renata's lawyer and his confident tie, all of it. Lawrence listened the way good lawyers and judges learn to listen, without leaking reaction, just taking it in. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did you ever threaten your daughter-in-law or your son in any way?" "No." "Did you attempt to hide the property from anyone?" "No, it's in my name. Has been since 1998. I have the title documents." "Did you take money from them without intending to repay it?" I looked at him steadily. $4,000. I paid it back in 9 months. I have the e-transfer records. Lawrence nodded once. That's what he'd expected. Outside his window, Hamilton looked gray and cold, the way it does in March. That particular Canadian gray that hasn't decided yet whether to become rain or just stay gray indefinitely. "You know what they're arguing," he said. "That I'm a burden. And the subtext. That old men who've lost their wives get confused about property law." He almost smiled. "Henry, there's something you should know." He opened a folder on his desk. "After the recess, I made a call to the Ontario Fire Marshal's archive. I asked about a Captain Henry Croft, Station 4, Sudbury. I said nothing." "You received a commissioner's citation in 2009. "I did. For pulling 3 people out of a residential fire on Regent Street while the structure was actively collapsing. There were 4 of us on that call. The citation should have gone to all of us. There's also a commendation from 2014. That one I disagree with. And—" He paused. "A letter in your file from a woman named Joanne Lafleur. She wrote to the fire service in 2017 to say that a captain named Henry Croft drove to Timmins on his own time and his own gas money after her son was released from addiction treatment. Because her son had told her that you were the one who'd talked to him in the hospital. You'd gone in to assess the building damage after a fire in his apartment, and instead of leaving, you'd sat with him for 2 hours." I looked out the window at the gray Hamilton sky. I didn't know she'd written that. "People don't forget the ones who stop to sit with them," Lawrence said. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he said, "Do you remember the night you found me?" And of course I did. I will always remember it. January 2001. Ice storm. The kind Ontario gets once every 15 years. The kind that doesn't just put ice on the roads, but encases everything in it. Every branch, every wire, every surface, until the whole province sounds like it's made of glass. We lost power across 3 counties. There were structural collapses from the ice load. Older buildings, barns, a church roof in Chapleau, a section of commercial block in Timmins. Lawrence was a young Crown attorney at the time. He'd been driving back from a court date in North Bay when the storm escalated faster than the forecasts had predicted. His car had gone off the highway on a bridge overpass outside Sturgeon Falls when a patch of black ice caught him sideways. The car had gone through the guardrail, not off a cliff. The drop was only about 4 meters, but in January, in an ice storm, at night, 4 meters is enough. His car had landed on its side on a frozen service road below the bridge. He'd gotten the door open, but he was injured, couldn't walk properly, and the temperature was dropping. We'd been responding to the church collapse when the call came in. A motorist, possible location, uncertain condition. My lieutenant told me there wasn't enough crew to split. He was right. I took the truck anyway with one other firefighter, a big quiet man named Alistair, who never once questioned a decision I made and who retired in 2018 and now lives in Muskoka and sends me a card every Christmas. We found Lawrence by flashlight after 40 minutes of searching the service road from both ends. He was sitting against the underside of the bridge, with his jacket pulled over his head, trying to keep his core temperature up. He'd been there for over 2 hours. His right ankle was badly fractured. His lips were the color of old putty. He looked up at our flashlight beams the way people do when they've stopped expecting to be found. "You told me to stop apologizing," Lawrence said now, in his chambers. "You kept saying, 'Stop apologizing and start moving your arms and legs.' And I thought that was a fairly rude thing to say to a person who was nearly dead." It worked, it did. He looked at me. "You gave me your extra gloves. On the drive back, you took them off and gave them to me. I'd forgotten that part. Henry." He leaned forward. "What your daughter-in-law's lawyer said out there. You know what they're trying to do. I do. They're going to argue diminished capacity, that the property should be assessed as part of a dependency relationship. I know. I want to be clear that this court is going to be scrupulously fair. I'm going to recuse myself from any ruling on the property matter, specifically. That will go to an associate. But the characterization of you, the way you were described in that opening, I want you to understand that characterizations require evidence. And evidence works in both directions." He closed the folder and looked at me directly. "Is there anything you want to tell me before we go back out there?" I thought about it. "I want my son to be okay," I said. "Whatever happens with the property, I want Kevin to be okay." Lawrence nodded slowly. That, I think, was all the evidence he needed. When we walked back into the courtroom together, the shift in the room was immediate. Not loud, but real. The way a room changes when something invisible has been redistributed. Kevin was watching me from the gallery. He'd always been able to read a room. Got that from his mother, not from me. When he saw my face, something in his shoulders came down slightly. Renata sat very still. Her lawyer stood as soon as Lawrence took the bench. "Your Honor, I must state for the record my concern regarding. I've already addressed my own impartiality with both parties in chambers," Lawrence said pleasantly. "The property matter will be assessed by Associate Judge Okonkwo, who will receive the full file. This hearing will continue on the question of the characterizations made in opening statements, which this court takes seriously." Steele sat back down. "The financial records, transfer documents, the title to the Chaplow property, which was unambiguous and which a Daisy presented with the calm of someone setting down a very large card in a game she has already won." Then Steele tried a different approach. "Mr. Croft," he said very carefully, "would you agree that your mental and emotional state following your wife's death may have affected your ability to make clear financial decisions?" "I would agree that grief is difficult," I said. "And would you agree that you relied heavily on your son and his family during that period?" "I visited often. I helped with the grandchildren when I could. I paid for every visit and every meal that was mine to pay for." "But you borrowed money." $4,000, I said. "In February 2021, I paid it back in November of the same year. I can provide the records." Steele shifted. "Mr. Croft, isn't it true that you have no income other than your pension?" "I have a pension from 31 years of service with the Ontario Fire Service." "Yes. And that pension is enough," I said quietly. "It has always been enough." Steele glanced at his notes. Then he made the mistake of trying one more angle. Mr. Croft, isn't it fair to say that the stress of your role, the psychological weight of emergency service work over 3 decades, has left you, in some respects, less equipped to navigate family and financial relationships? The courtroom went very still. I looked at him for a moment. You're asking me, I said, whether 31 years of running into burning buildings when other people were running out has made me less capable of managing my own affairs. He opened his mouth. My wife died, I said. I grieved. I was quieter than usual. I made fewer phone calls than I should have. I'm not going to argue with any of that. I paused, but I paid my bills. I maintained my property. I paid back every cent I borrowed from my son. And I still hold legal title to land that has been in my family for 50 years. Steele looked at his legal pad. Then something happened I did not expect. Kevin stood up. He wasn't supposed to stand up. He was in the gallery. People in the gallery don't stand up. The bailiff half rose from his chair. Lawrence looked toward him. Kevin said, Your Honor, I'd like to say something. Renata grabbed his arm. He looked down at her hand on his arm, and then he looked back at the bench. Mr. Lawrence checked his notes. Mr. Kevin Croft, you're not currently called as a witness. I know, Kevin said. But my father's lawyer can call me if that's what's required. I have something to say and I think the court should hear it. Lawrence considered this for a moment. Sit down for now, he said. We'll address that formally. Kevin sat, but Renata had let go of his arm. A daisy requested Kevin be called. Lawrence allowed it. Steele objected and was overruled on the grounds that the characterizations about my conduct had been made by his own client's opening, and the court had a reasonable interest in corroborating testimony. Kevin took the stand. He looked like Helen around the eyes. He always has. Mr. Croft, a daze began. Can you describe your father's role in your family over the past 4 years? Kevin looked at me before answering. My father moved to Burlington because I asked him to, he said. I asked him, not the other way around. I was worried about him being alone in Sudbury after my mother died. He paused. He drove my daughters to school when Renata and I both had early meetings. He fixed the furnace twice because he knew how, and a repairman would have cost $800. He taught Lily how to skate properly and took Sophie to every one of her swimming lessons from September to June. That's not a burden. That's a grandfather. The room was quiet. Dad. Kevin's voice shifted, less formal now. Somewhere in the room, Lawrence Beaumont was very carefully keeping his expression neutral. I should have said this a long time ago. I'm sorry I let things get this far. Renata was looking at the table. Steele had stopped taking notes. I looked at my hands. Kevin has his mother's hands. I've thought about that ever since he was a child. When the recess came, I stepped outside the courthouse into the March cold. Hamilton smelled like concrete and the faint industrial edge that comes off the waterfront when the wind is wrong. I stood on the steps and let the cold sit on my face for a minute. Kevin came out a few minutes behind me. We stood there side by side the way men do when they have more to say than they know how to organize. I didn't know about the loan being paid back, he finally said. Renata handles the accounts. I should have known. It was a long time ago. Dad, Kevin. He looked out at the street. She's not a bad person. I know she's not. She just gets. He stopped. Focused, I offered. He almost laughed. Yeah. We stood there a while longer. A streetcar went by 2 blocks over, that particular sound it makes when the rails are cold. There's nowhere else in the world that sounds quite like a Canadian city in winter, and I've always loved it despite everything. I sold the Harley in 2020, I said. Not sure why I said it then. It just came out. Kevin turned to look at me. What? The motorcycle. I sold it when things got tight after the pandemic. I didn't say anything because I didn't want you worrying. He stared at me. Dad, you loved that bike. I loved your mother more. She would have told me to sell it. Kevin looked away quickly. When he looked back, his jaw was doing the thing it does when he's trying to hold something together. I found something in the cabin last summer, he said, when I drove up to check on the property. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. In the drawer of the kitchen table. I've been carrying it around for 8 months, not knowing what to do with it. I recognized it before he unfolded it. The note paper. Helen's handwriting on the outside, mine on the inside. Mom's? He said. No, mine. I left it there the August after she died. I went up to the cabin by myself to close it up for winter, and I wrote something. I meant to leave it there, like a message in a bottle. I looked at the paper in his hands. I didn't think anyone would find it. Kevin unfolded it carefully. I'd written, I know this isn't what you expected when you married me. The quiet. The hours I spent somewhere else even when I was home. I know you deserved more of me than I knew how to give. I'm going to figure out how to say these things to Kevin before it's too late. I love you. I always loved you. I'm going to try harder. Kevin read it twice. Then he folded it back along its original lines. You never said any of that to me, he said. The trying harder part. I know. Why not? I looked at the bare trees along the courthouse street, the way they go so skeletal and exposed in March before anything starts coming back. I didn't know if the words still mattered, I said. Kevin put the letter in his pocket. Then he put his arm around my shoulders, briefly the way men do it, quick and certain, and then done. They mattered, he said. The property ruling came 6 weeks later from Associate Judge Okonkwo. Title remained with me, fully and completely, as the documents had always indicated. The application to have it assessed as a shared family asset was dismissed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired in the good way, the way you feel when something heavy is finally set down. I'm still in the Burlington bungalow. Kevin comes by on Sundays most weeks. Sometimes Renata comes too. Things between us are careful in the way of people who said things they can't unsay and are working around them. That takes time. I know it takes time. What changed, I think, is that Kevin sees me more clearly now, and I let him. Lily is 12 this year. She started asking questions about my time in the fire service. Not the dangerous parts. She's not interested in those. She wants to know what it felt like to run towards something everyone else was running away from. I've told her it wasn't bravery, exactly. It was more like a decision you make before the fear has time to catch up with you. She thought about that for a while. Grandpa, she said, do you think you could teach me to skate backwards? Sophie learned and now she won't stop bragging about it. I told her absolutely. We went to the rink the following Saturday. Lawrence Beaumont sent me a letter after the ruling came through. Short, professional, 2 paragraphs. At the bottom, in handwriting different from the typed body of the letter, he'd added, the gloves, by the way, are still in a box in my garage. I kept them. L. I sat with that letter for a long time at my kitchen table. There are people in your life who appear briefly, in the worst possible circumstances, and change the direction of things without either of you fully understanding it at the time. Sometimes the debts run in directions you never expected. A few months after everything settled, I drove up to Chaplow alone, early May, when the lakes are just starting to clear, and the birch trees have that new pale green that only lasts about a week before it deepens. I opened the cabin, swept out the winter dust, checked the dock. It needed 2 new planks. It always needs 2 new planks, and then I sat on the end of it for an hour with my coffee and the particular silence of Northern Ontario when nobody else is around. Helen used to say that lake made everything make sense. I used to nod and say yes, and not be entirely sure what she meant. I'm starting to understand what she meant. The older I get, the more I think the people who hold things together quietly, the ones who go back into the burning buildings, the ones who sit with strangers in hospital corridors, the ones who drive 4 hours in an ice storm to make sure somebody's father is okay. Those people rarely get told that what they did mattered. Not while they're doing it. Sometimes not ever. If there's someone in your life carrying things quietly, and you haven't told them recently that you see them, I hope you'll find the time. The window for saying those things is always narrower than we imagine.